Millionaire abandons horse and a poor girl finds it and changes her life. It all began when a colt appeared running alone on a deserted road. The girl decided to follow it, and what she found behind the fence looked like a nightmare. But it was at that moment she made a choice, and nothing would ever be the same again. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The sun was beginning to hide behind the hills when Emily left home for the third time that day. At 12 years old, she already knew every stone on the path that led to the road, every curve where she might find something to bring home. Her mother had been bedridden for weeks, and her father worked from sunrise to sunset on a distant farm. The responsibility of finding food for the family had fallen on her small but determined shoulders. That afternoon, something was different. A strange sound cut through the air. It wasn't the usual noise of cars on the road or the wind in the trees. It was a low moan, almost human, coming from the direction of Colonel Sebastian Montgomery's land, the most feared man in the region. Emily stopped, her heart racing. Everyone in the community knew the stories about the colonel, his uncontrolled fury, his cruel methods, the way he treated both animals and people who crossed him. But the sound continued, persistent and desperate. It was as if someone was asking for help in a way that only the heart could understand. Emily looked at the empty basket in her hands and then in the direction from which the lament came. Her mother always said that when God puts something in our path, it's because we have the strength to face it. She took a deep breath and decided to investigate. That's when she saw the colt. It was young with shiny chestnut fur, but its eyes revealed a terror that didn't match its age. The animal was standing at the edge of the road, trembling, staring fixedly at the colonel's property. When it noticed Emily's presence, it didn't run away as expected. Instead, it walked up to her, pressed its muzzle against her hand, and made a low sound, almost like a request. "What is it, little one?" whispered Emily, stroking the colt's neck. "Are you scared of something?" The colt backed away a few steps and looked at her, then at the property, then back at her again. It was as if it was trying to communicate something urgent. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something deeply wrong with this situation. At that moment, a scream echoed across the property. Not a human scream, but the desperate whinny of an animal in distress. The colt jumped, agitated, and began to walk toward the sound. It stopped, looked at Emily, and continued walking. It was clear that it wanted her to follow. "I can't go in there," Emily muttered to herself, remembering her parents' warnings about never going near Colonel Montgomery's land. But the colt didn't give up. It came back to her, gently pushed her hand with its muzzle, and walked again in the direction of the property. The whinny was repeated, more shrill this time, filled with a pain that cut through the air like a blade. Emily closed her eyes, trying to decide what to do. When she opened them, she found the colt's eyes fixed on hers. There was something in that look that she recognized, the same desperation she felt when she saw her mother suffering and didn't know how to help. "All right," she said quietly, hiding her basket behind a tree, "but we're just going to take a look." The colt seemed to understand and began to guide her along a trail that went around the property. Emily had never been so close to Colonel Montgomery's farm. The big house stood imposingly at the top of a hill, surrounded by pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, but there was something oppressive about that beauty, as if it hid dark secrets. As they walked, Emily began to hear other sounds, the metallic noise of a chainsaw being turned on and off repeatedly, male shouts filled with anger, and underneath it all a continuous lament that made her chest tighten. The colt led her to a barbed wire fence that separated two pastures. There, Emily saw a scene she would never forget for the rest of her life. A white mare of extraordinary beauty was trapped in the fence wires. Her brilliant fur was stained with blood, and she struggled weakly to free herself, only managing to injure herself more. With each movement, a low moan escaped from her throat, but what shocked Emily most was realizing that the injuries weren't just the result of the barbed wire. There were deeper cuts, marks suggesting that the mare had been chased, terrorized, before desperately trying to escape through that fence. "My God," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hands. The colt approached the mare, making low, comforting sounds. It was obvious there was a bond between them. Perhaps they were mother and son. Emily felt tears burning her eyes, as she realized that the colt had come seeking help for its mother. Without thinking of the consequences, Emily ran to the fence and began to examine how the mare was trapped. The wires had wrapped around her hind legs and belly, creating a cruel trap. Every movement the mare made to free herself only caused the wires to cut deeper. "Easy, girl," said Emily in a soft voice, approaching slowly. "I'm going to help you." The mare looked at her with distrust at first, but there was something in the girl's tone of voice that reassured her. Emily began to work on the wires, trying to find a way to release them without causing more injuries. Her small hands were soon cut and bleeding, but she didn't stop. That's when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. Her blood froze when she recognized Colonel Sebastian Montgomery's hoarse voice. "What the hell is going on here?" roared the man, appearing among the trees like a storm. Emily froze, still gripping the barbed wire. Colonel Montgomery was even more intimidating up close. A tall, broad man with small, hard eyes that seemed capable of piercing through a person. His clothes were dirty, and he carried an idle chainsaw in his right hand. "I asked what you're doing on my property, girl," he shouted, advancing toward her. I just wanted to help the mare," stammered Emily, her hands shaking. "She's hurt." "That mare is my property," bellowed the colonel, "and she's exactly where she should be. Nobody told her to disobey me." Emily felt a chill as she realized what these words really meant. The mare hadn't been hurt by accident. She had been placed there deliberately as punishment. "But she's going to—" She began to protest. "She's going nothing," interrupted the colonel, starting the chainsaw for a few seconds just to produce that terrifying sound. The mare violently thrashed upon hearing the noise, cutting herself even more. "She's going to stay there until she learns to respect me, and you're going to leave my land now before I call the police and tell them you're trying to steal my animal." Emily looked at the mare, then at the colt watching everything with frightened eyes, then at the man holding the saw. She knew she had no choice. With a broken heart, she began to back away. "And don't even think about coming back," shouted the colonel after her. "Don't even think about telling this story to anyone. Nobody will believe a ragged girl like you." Emily ran along the trail, tears streaming down her face, her hands bleeding, the sound of the mare's moans echoing in her ears. The colt followed her for a few meters, but then stopped, torn between following Emily and going back to stay near its mother. When she finally reached the road, Emily leaned against a tree and cried like she had never cried before. The image of the trapped mare, bleeding, suffering, was etched in her mind. And the worst part was knowing that she had been placed there on purpose, as punishment for something that probably wasn't even her fault. But as she cried, a determination began to grow inside her. The colonel was wrong. She wasn't simply going to forget what she saw. No matter how powerful or scary he was, that mare needed help, and she was going to find a way to get that help. She wiped away her tears, picked up her basket, and began to run toward the community. Someone somewhere would have to have the courage to do the right thing, and if necessary, she would knock on every door until she found that person. The first door Emily knocked on was that of their closest neighbors, the Sanders. Mrs. Mary Sanders opened the door a crack and frowned when she saw the girl with bandaged hands and eyes swollen from crying. "What happened to you, child?" she asked. But even before Emily could fully tell her story, the woman's face closed up at hearing Colonel Montgomery's name. "Emily, for God's sake," whispered Mrs. Sanders, looking nervously to the sides. "You can't go around saying these things. The colonel has ears everywhere." "But you don't understand," insisted Emily, her voice breaking. "The mare is suffering terribly. She might—" "I don't want to know," interrupted Mrs. Sanders, already closing the door. "And you shouldn't have gone there. Forget what you saw and never meddle where you're not called again." The door closed with a dry thud, leaving Emily alone on the porch. She stood there for a few minutes, trying to understand how someone could simply ignore so much suffering. But she didn't give up. There were other houses, other people. At the Olivers' house, the story repeated itself. Mr. John Oliver began to listen to her attentively, but as soon as she mentioned the colonel, the man went pale. "Girl, are you crazy?" he said, lowering his voice. "That man has already destroyed the lives of people much more powerful than us. My cousin tried to report him once because of a horse that appeared nearly sick on our land. You know what happened? He lost his job, couldn't get work anywhere else in the region, and ended up having to move to another state. But we can't just leave the mare there," protested Emily. "We can and we will," replied Mr. Oliver, already gently pushing her out. "And you'll do the same if you have any sense. House after house, the reaction was always the same. Some people wouldn't even let Emily finish speaking. Others listened with expressions of pity, but shook their heads and closed their doors. An elderly lady even cried with her, but said she couldn't do anything because she depended on a pension that the colonel could make disappear with a single phone call. The sun was already setting when Emily arrived at Mrs. Rose's house, a woman known for her faith and kindness. If anyone in the community would have courage, it would be her. Emily knocked on the door with her heart full of hope. Mrs. Rose received her with kindness, offered water, and even properly cleaned the wounds on her hands while listening to the story. When Emily finished, the woman remained silent for long minutes, just shaking her head. "Child," she finally said, "my heart is broken by what you've told me, but sometimes God allows certain things to happen for reasons we cannot understand." "Do you think God wants the mayor to suffer?" asked Emily, incredulous. "I don't know, child. I just know that messing with Colonel Montgomery is like playing with fire, and I have 5 young grandchildren to care for. If something happens to me, who will look after them?" Another door closed, another hope dissolved. Emily walked through the empty streets of the community, feeling more alone than ever. The fear of the colonel was like a shadow that covered the entire region, paralyzing even the most kind-hearted people. It was already night when she decided to make one last attempt. There was a house at the end of the main street that had always intrigued Emily. It was small, simple, but very well kept. She never saw anyone enter or leave, but sometimes noticed movement in the windows. People in the community rarely talked about who lived there, and when they did, it was always in whispers. Emily knocked on the door, not expecting much. To her surprise, the door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting. A man of about 50 appeared. He had graying hair, tired but kind eyes, and calloused hands of someone who worked with animals. "You're the girl who's looking for help for a mare?" he said, without even waiting for her to speak. Emily's eyes widened. "How do you know?" "Because in this community, news travels faster than the wind," the man replied, opening the door wider. "And because I know Colonel Montgomery better than anyone here. My name is John Baptiste, but you can call me John. Come in." The house inside was simple but cozy. The walls were covered with photographs of horses. Some were magnificent animals running in pastures. Others appeared injured or sick, being cared for. On a side table, Emily noticed a wooden box locked with a padlock. John prepared some tea and sat across from her. "Now tell me everything from the beginning, and don't be afraid. Here you can speak the truth." Emily repeated her story, this time without being interrupted. John listened attentively, asking specific questions about the mayor's injuries, about the colt's behavior, about the exact words the colonel had used. When she finished, he remained silent for long minutes, just drumming his fingers on the table. 15 years ago, I worked for Colonel Montgomery," he finally said. "I was the veterinarian on his farm. I thought I was there to care for the animals, but I soon discovered I was there to turn a blind eye to the horrors he committed." John's eyes grew distant, as if he were reliving painful memories. "There was a horse on the farm, a black stallion named Thunder. He was the noblest animal I've ever known in my life. Intelligent, loyal, brave. But the colonel wanted to break his spirit, make him submissive through fear." "What did he do?" asked Emily, although part of her didn't want to know the answer. "He used methods that no living being should endure. Loud noises, sharp objects to intimidate, confinement in small spaces, deprivation of water and food. And when I tried to intervene, he threatened me, said that if I said anything, I would not only lose my job, but would never be able to work anywhere again." John stood up and walked to the window. "One day, Thunder couldn't take it anymore. His heart simply stopped beating during a training session. That's when I decided I had to do something." "And what did you do?" "I began to document everything secretly. I recorded conversations, took photos of the animal's injuries, kept medical reports that he forced me to falsify." John pointed to the locked box. "It's all in there. 15 years of evidence of Colonel Montgomery's crimes." Emily felt her heart race. "Then you can help the mayor." "I can try," said John, but his voice carried an enormous weight. "But you need to understand something. When I tried to use this evidence for the first time, the colonel found out. He not only fired me, but spread stories about me throughout the region. They said I was mentally unstable, that I made up stories about mistreatment to get revenge on him. I lost all my clients. I lost my wife, who couldn't stand the social pressure. I lost almost everything." "But why didn't you try again?" John sat back down, looking directly into Emily's eyes. Because I was a coward. Yes, I admit it. I was afraid of losing the little I had left. But today, hearing your story, seeing the courage of a 12-year-old girl who wasn't afraid to cut herself trying to save an animal she didn't even know. He paused, his eyes shining. Today I'm ashamed of my cowardice. John got up and went to the box, taking a key that was hidden behind one of the pictures. 15 years keeping this evidence, waiting to have the courage to use it. Maybe it's time. When he opened the box, Emily saw piles of photographs, documents, small old recorders, and even vials with what appeared to be medicine samples. It was like looking at a detective's file. "With all this, can we save the mayor?" asked Emily, hope growing again in her chest. "We can try," replied John. "But it won't be easy. The colonel has a lot of power, a lot of connections, and when he discovers we're messing with him, he'll react like an injured animal, dangerously." "I don't care," said Emily with determination. "That mare needs help, and I'm not going to give up on her." John looked at the girl in front of him, small, with simple and patched clothes, bandaged hands, but eyes that shone with a courage he had lost long ago. He felt something move inside his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. "Then let's do this," he said, closing the box. "Tomorrow morning we'll go back there together. But this time we'll be prepared." Dawn arrived grey and cloudy, as if the sky itself sensed the storm that was coming. Emily had barely slept, constantly reliving the image of the mare trapped in the fence. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of desperate whinnies that woke her several times during the night. John was waiting for her at his house with a backpack full of equipment, a small camera, some basic veterinary instruments, and a careful selection of the most important evidence he had collected over the years. His eyes were determined, but Emily could sense the nervousness in his slightly trembling hands. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked one last time as they walked down the road toward the colonel's property. "I am," Emily answered without hesitation. "And you?" John smiled for the first time since she had met him. "Now I am. You know, girls, sometimes we need someone braver than ourselves to remind us of who we really are." When they reached the fence where the mare was trapped, the scene they found was even more devastating than Emily remembered. The mare had stopped fighting and now remained motionless, just breathing with difficulty. Her injuries had worsened during the night, and flies were beginning to gather around the open wounds. The colt was nearby, keeping watch, but seemed to have lost hope. "My God," whispered John, his voice breaking. 15 years have passed, and he's still the same monster. John approached the mare with slow, precise movements, talking softly to reassure her. Emily watched with admiration how he seemed to have a natural gift for communicating with animals. The mare, who the day before had shown distrust, now allowed John to examine her injuries. "She's dehydrated and has lost a lot of blood," murmured John, working carefully to release the wires. "But we can still save her if we act quickly." It was delicate and time-consuming work. John had to cut some of the wires with small pliers, taking care not to cause more injuries. Emily helped as she could, holding some wires while he worked, ignoring the pain in her own injured hands. Finally, after almost an hour, they managed to free the mare completely. The animal tried to stand up, but her hind legs were too injured. John quickly began cleaning the wounds and applying an antiseptic spray he had brought. "Will she be able to walk?" asked Emily, gently stroking the mare's neck. "She will, but she needs proper medical care urgently," replied John. "We'll take her slowly to exactly where do you think you're taking my property?" Colonel Montgomery's icy voice cut through the air like a blade. Emily felt her blood freeze. The man was standing a few meters away from them, this time accompanied by 2 large men who clearly worked as security guards. "Colonel," said John, rising slowly, "we're just providing medical care to an injured animal." "You're trespassing on my property and trying to steal my animal," retorted the colonel, his voice filled with contained rage. "And you, John Baptiste, should know very well that you're not welcome here after everything you've done." "After everything I've done?" John stepped forward, and Emily saw decades of repressed anger shining in his eyes. "I never did anything but try to protect innocent animals from your barbaric methods." The colonel laughed, a cold and unpleasant sound. "Barbaric methods? Is that what you call discipline? These animals cost thousands of dollars, and I have the right to educate them as I see fit." "Educate?" Emily's voice trembled with indignation. "You call it education to chase an animal with a chainsaw and leave it trapped in barbed wire to bleed?" The colonel's face turned red with anger. "How dare you question me, you filthy girl? You're nothing but a trespasser, a thief." It was at that moment that John pulled out the small camera he had brought and began filming. "Keep talking, Colonel. I want to make sure your words are well recorded." "Turn that thing off," roared the Colonel, signaling for his security guards to approach. "I'm not turning off anything," said John firmly. "For 15 years I kept quiet about your crimes. I won't be silent anymore." "Crimes?" The Colonel forced a laugh. "What crimes? Taking care of my own animals on my own land? You're crazy, John. You always were. That's why nobody gives you work anymore." But as he spoke, the Colonel didn't notice that other people were beginning to approach. The argument had attracted attention, and curious onlookers were gathering on the other side of the fence. Emily recognized some faces. Mrs. Mary Sanders, Mr. John Oliver, even Mrs. Rose was there. "Look closely," said John loudly, pointing to the injured mare. "See the result of Colonel Montgomery's discipline?" A murmur spread among the observers. Some people covered their mouths in shock at the sight of the mare. A woman began to cry. "All of you get out of here," shouted the Colonel, visibly nervous about the presence of the witnesses. "This is private property." It was then that something happened that no one expected. The mare, who until then had remained lying down, made a tremendous effort and managed to stand up. Her legs were shaking, but she was standing, and slowly, majestically, she walked to where Emily was. The colt immediately approached, positioning itself beside its mother. And then, in a moment that would be forever etched in the memory of all present, the two animals positioned themselves between the Colonel and Emily, as if they were protecting the girl who had tried to save them. The silence that followed was almost supernatural. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. The mare, despite her injuries, kept her head held high with dignity. Her eyes, which the day before showed only pain and fear, now shone with something different, gratitude and renewed courage. "Take a picture," someone in the crowd whispered. "Someone needs to take a picture of this scene." Emily heard the click of several cell phone cameras. The image of the injured mare and the colt protecting the girl who had tried to save them was being captured from multiple angles. The Colonel, realizing that the situation was getting out of his control, made an abrupt gesture to his security guards. "Arrest these two for trespassing and attempted theft." The guards approached, but were surprised by something unexpected. The crowd on the other side of the fence began to grow rapidly. People who had received messages about what was happening were coming from all directions, and for the first time in decades, they didn't seem intimidated by the Colonel. "Leave them alone," shouted a voice in the crowd. "The mare needs medical help," shouted another. "This is animal cruelty." A third voice joined the chorus. John took advantage of the confusion to approach Emily. "Now," he whispered, "now we act." He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he had kept for 15 years, but never had the courage to use. When someone answered on the other end, his voice was firm and clear. "Police? I'd like to report a serious case of animal cruelty. I have documented evidence of 15 years of mistreatment, and at the moment there is an injured animal that needs urgent help." The Colonel heard the call and his face went livid. "Hang up that phone," he shouted, trying to advance toward John. But the mare and the colt moved, blocking his path. And for the first time since Emily had met him, she saw real fear in Colonel Montgomery's eyes. "They're already on their way," said John, hanging up the phone. "And this time, Colonel, they won't just believe your version of the story." The next 30 minutes were the most tense Emily had ever experienced. Colonel Montgomery alternated between trying to intimidate the witnesses and making frantic calls to his contacts, trying to control the situation before the police arrived. But photos of the injured mare and the colt protecting Emily were already spreading through social media with impressive speed. When they finally heard the sound of sirens approaching, a remarkable transformation happened in the crowd. People who had lived for decades under the fear of the Colonel began to speak. Mrs. Mary Sanders was the first to speak up. "I've seen terrible things on this farm too," she said with a trembling but firm voice. "Injured animals, screams during the night, but I was afraid to speak." "Me too," said Mr. John Oliver. "My cousin told me stories that gave me nightmares, but the Colonel is very powerful." "Was powerful," corrected a young voice in the crowd. It was Michael, a young man of about 20 who worked on a neighboring farm. "I once saw him beat a horse with a piece of iron until the animal fainted. When I tried to intervene, he threatened me with a gun." More and more people began to speak, as if a dam had broken after decades of silence. The colonel grew increasingly pale as he heard the accounts. His attempts to deny everything sounded increasingly weak in the face of the volume of witnesses. When the police finally arrived, led by Sheriff Charles Miller, the colonel immediately changed his strategy. He assumed the posture of a victim, claiming he was the target of a conspiracy orchestrated by a resentful former employee and a disturbed girl. "Sheriff," said the colonel in his most convincing voice, "you've known me for years. You know I'm a respectable man. This mare hurt herself trying to jump the fence. It's an unfortunate accident, but it wasn't intentional." Sheriff Miller was known in the region for being a fair man, but also a cautious one. Emily saw in his eyes that he was carefully weighing all the information before making a decision. It was then that John approached, carrying his box of evidence. "Sheriff, I have here 15 years of documentation about Colonel Montgomery's methods. Photographs, recordings, falsified medical reports that he forced me to sign." "Lies from a bitter man," protested the colonel. "He was fired for incompetence and has been making up stories to get revenge ever since." But as John began to show the evidence, the sheriff's face changed. There were photos of animals with clearly non-accidental injuries, audio recordings where the colonel's voice could be heard shouting threats, medical documents with suspicious erasures. "And there's more," said John, his voice gaining strength. "Yesterday this brave girl tried to help the injured mare, and the colonel threatened her with a running chainsaw." "That's a very serious accusation," said the sheriff, looking directly at the colonel. "Do you have any explanation for this?" The colonel began to stammer, trying to formulate a response, when something unexpected happened. The colt, which until then had remained quiet beside its mother, approached the sheriff and gently touched his hand with its muzzle. The sheriff, surprised, looked at the young animal. There was something in the colt's eyes, an intelligence, a silent plea, that deeply touched the heart of the lawman. He knelt beside the animal and then looked at the injured mare. "In 30 years of career," said the sheriff slowly, "I've learned that animals don't lie, and this colt is clearly asking for help." It was at that moment that a team of veterinarians arrived that John had managed to contact through former colleagues in the profession. When they began to examine the mare, their expressions became increasingly grim. "These injuries are not consistent with an accident," said the chief veterinarian, Dr. Anna Lewis. "There is clear evidence of prolonged mistreatment. This animal has been systematically tortured." The word tortured fell like a bomb on all those present. Even those who suspected the colonel's cruelty were shocked by the medical confirmation. The colonel, realizing that his version of events was crumbling, made one last desperate attempt. He pulled some documents from his briefcase and presented them to the sheriff. "I have here a court order of repossession," he said with a trembling voice. "This animal is my legal property, and these people are committing theft." The sheriff examined the documents carefully, but John approached with an expression that Emily had never seen before, a mixture of satisfaction and justice. "Sheriff," said John, "these documents are fake and I can prove it." He opened his box once more and removed a folder he had kept at the bottom. "Here are the original purchase documents for this mare. She wasn't bought by the colonel. She was stolen from a farm in Tennessee 2 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. The colonel went livid, realizing he had been caught in a lie that could completely destroy him. "Furthermore," continued John, "I have recordings here where the colonel himself admits to having falsified ownership documents for other animals over the years." It was the final blow. The sheriff, faced with so much evidence, had no choice but to act. "Colonel Sebastian Montgomery, you are under arrest for animal cruelty, forgery of documents, theft and threats against witnesses." As the handcuffs were being placed on the colonel's wrists, something extraordinary happened. The mare, who had remained lying down during most of the investigation, made a supreme effort and stood up again. With slow but determined steps, she approached the man who had been her tormentor. For a moment, Emily thought the mare might attack him, but instead, the animal simply stared at him for long seconds. There was no hatred in her eyes. There was sadness, but also something that looked like forgiveness. It was then that the colonel, for the first time since Emily had met him, showed a genuine emotion. Tears began to stream down his hardened face. I didn't want it to come to this," he whispered, his voice broken. "My father taught me that strength was everything, that compassion was weakness. I never knew how to be different." No one in the crowd said a word. There was something deeply touching about seeing such a powerful and feared man finally acknowledge his mistakes. "But that doesn't justify what I did," continued the colonel, looking directly at Emily. "Girl, you have more courage at 12 years old than I've had in my entire life. Forgive me." Emily felt tears burning her eyes. They weren't tears of anger or fear, but of something deeper, the understanding that even the cruelest people can find redemption when confronted with the consequences of their actions. In the months that followed, many things changed in the region. The colonel's property was seized by the government and transformed into a sanctuary for rescued animals. John was appointed as the medical director of the sanctuary, finally being able to use his knowledge to heal instead of covering up suffering. The mayor, who received the name Emily in honor of the girl who saved her, recovered completely from her injuries. She and her colt, baptized as Valor, became symbols of the transformation that had happened in the community. Emily and her family received a new home on the sanctuary grounds, where she could care for the animals and continue her studies with a special scholarship provided by an animal protection organization that had become interested in her story. Every day, Emily spent a few hours with the mare and the colt, running through fields that were once prisons and now were symbols of freedom. The mare had become not just a free animal, but a proud mother who taught her son about trust and hope. The story spread far beyond the limits of the small community. Journalists came from distant cities to interview Emily, who always spoke with simplicity about her experience. "I didn't do anything special," she always said. "I just did what any person would do if they listened to their heart." But everyone knew it wasn't true. In a world where fear often paralyzes even the bravest adults, a 12-year-old girl had found the strength to fight against injustice. Colonel Montgomery served his sentence and during his time in prison underwent psychological therapy that helped him understand the roots of his cruelty. When he was released, he sent a letter to the sanctuary offering all his remaining fortune to help care for the rescued animals. The offer was accepted, not as forgiveness, but as a step toward reparation. And so, the money that was once used to cause suffering was transformed into resources for healing and protection. On a golden Sunday afternoon, exactly 1 year after the rescue, Emily was sitting under a tree watching the mare and the colt running freely through the fields. John approached and sat down beside her. "You know," he said, "I spent 15 years gathering evidence, waiting to have the courage to act. But in the end, it took a brave girl to teach me that doing the right thing is worth any risk." Emily smiled, stroking the muzzle of the colt that had approached to receive affection. "I learned that when we follow our hearts, we're never alone. Someone always appears to help us." As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with golden and rosy hues, the mare approached Emily and gently rested her head on the girl's shoulder. It was her way of saying thank you, not just for saving her, but for restoring her faith in human kindness. The story of Emily, the mare, and the colt became legend in the region, passed from generation to generation as a reminder that true courage is not in being strong or powerful, but in doing what is right, even when it seems impossible. And so a girl who left home looking for food for her family found something much greater, the discovery that even the smallest gestures of compassion can transform the world around us. The end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Emily, the mare, and the colt Valor has deeply touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that true strength lies in compassion and that small acts of kindness can create waves of transformation that reach far beyond what we imagine. If this story awakened emotions in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. That way you help us continue sharing stories that celebrate the best of human nature. In the comments, tell us, have you ever lived through or witnessed situations where one person's courage made all the difference? Every day we bring new narratives that explore the deep bonds between humans and animals, stories of overcoming, forgiveness, and hope. Don't miss our next content, because each story is a window for us to discover more about ourselves and about the transformative power of empathy. Until the next adventure, and remember, sometimes being brave is simply choosing to do what the heart tells us is right.